My name is Kees Leijnhorst, and I welcome you to this event by Radboud Reflects. Probably, arguably, one of the most wicked, if not the most wicked problem of our age is the climate crisis. Now, we all try, many of us try to do our best to help solve this crisis, if it can be solved at all, by taking individual action. But tonight we're going to look at a different level. We're going to look at the level of collective action. Governments, international organizations, all trying desperately to avert the danger posed by the climate crisis. But obviously, so far at least, we as a collective have not been able to manage this problem. We haven't been able to find proper solutions. What is it that causes this? What is the nature of collective action? What is asked from collective entities like the United Nations, the World Bank, and that kind of organizations, but also societal, social organizations? Might they be of help in solving the climate crisis? So I guess we're going to talk a lot about collective action. And as is already announced at the board here, we've got two very eminent scholars who can talk us through this problem and its possible solution. So first, Daniel DeRock will talk to us. He's a political scientist here at Radboud University, specializing in international governance, especially governance on economic and ecological problems, ecological business. He'll be first, and he'll talk for 20 minutes, sharp, followed by Marc Davidson, who is a professor of sustainability at the philosophy department, also here at Radboud University, specializing in climate ethics. We're looking forward to a wonderful evening and a wonderful conversation. And I give the floor to Daniel.
So thank you, Kees, and thank you all for coming here. We have quite a challenge here tonight. Mark and I have been given the challenge of solving the problem of climate change together with all of you and environmental destruction. So we'll do our best. Now, as Kees said, I'm a political scientist. I'm an assistant professor of international relations. So I'm coming at this problem from a global governance perspective, right? Really at the global macro structural level. But we'll bring this, I think, in our discussion back to the individual level as well. So in the program for tonight, in the promotional text on the website, there was a series of questions, sort of promises that were made to you in terms of, what we would deliver and answer tonight. So I decided to start with this and structure my talk around this a little bit. So that you get your money's worth and at least answer these questions that you were promised. So let's see if I can give some short answers to these very difficult problems, and then go into a bit more detail later on in the lecture. So the first question was, why do we seem to fail in our collective action to address these problems of climate change and environmental destruction? All of these are complex, tricky questions, but my short answer is that it's hard. Global governance is tricky, and when we're dealing with very complex international agreements and treaties, like the Paris Climate Agreement, which I'll talk about, the more complex these are, in general, the more watered down they are, so that it's more likely that a higher number of countries will sign on to these agreements. Right? They become more ambiguous, more vague, in order to get all of these different parties, different countries on board with the same agreement. We also have very little time. Another reason it's difficult. So that brings us to our next question. Are these agreements clear enough? no, they're not. That's my short answer. And this has to do with the same reason I gave for the first question. The more complex and sticky these challenges are, and the more actors that are involved, the more vague these agreements have to be. They're non-binding and voluntary, as we'll talk about. Which other interests play a part? There are many, but I would argue that the most important, particularly because they block effective action, are international financial institutions, so the global financial system, and the fossil fuel industry. So the next question is, are we all equally accountable for a better outcome, or are some more than others? My clear answer is absolutely, some are more accountable than others, which we'll talk about later as well. In short, the richest countries are more responsible for the problem and have more of a responsibility to solve it. And also within these rich countries, the richest within them are more responsible than the poorest. And what's necessary to turn the tide towards a constructive collaboration? This is the really tricky question that we'll have to answer together. But my answer is that we need a paradigm shift, a new way of thinking. Together with that, a lot more imagination in terms of how we solve this problem, and a very powerful social movement, possibly more than we've ever seen in history. So I've answered these questions, and we can go on to the next talk, but I do have some more. And I want to have the background here be the scale of this crisis, right? So we all know something about climate change. We've heard something about the potential impacts of climate change, and we see some of them already. But just to put this into perspective with some numbers, what this first bullet point means, I've worded it in a bit of a complicated way, but what this basically means is that in order to meet the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius before the end of the century, that's compared to pre-industrial levels, we would need to basically cut emissions in half by 2030 and reduce them to zero, or what's called net zero, by 2050. And are we on track for this? No, we're absolutely not. So most countries are failing in their commitments. That's my pessimistic evaluation here. Emissions have continued to rise after the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And they're now 62% roughly higher than they were in 1990. So shortly after the Kyoto Protocol was signed, or shortly before the Kyoto Protocol was signed. That was the predecessor to the Paris Agreement, right? So ever since we've had these very ambitious targets, very ambitious global agreements, emissions have still continued to rise. To put this even more into perspective, prior to the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015, carbon emissions were on track to reach 4 degrees warming by the end of the century. Now, 4 degrees doesn't sound very much, but this is catastrophic, right? Already 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century is a terrible outcome. 1.5 degrees, which is our best possible scenario, involves quite a lot of suffering and destruction of ecosystems. But 4 degrees is something we want to avoid at all costs. Now, these are very difficult to predict. There's some very complex modeling involved. And we have arguably made some progress since the Paris Agreement. But if countries are not following through on their commitments, then this is the scenario that we potentially face. So the Paris Agreement, this is our best, this is the best solution we have right now in terms of global governance. It's not perfect, but it's an international treaty. The majority of countries have signed on to this, and it's been in effect since 2015. Right? We had another one before this. The Paris Agreement made some changes. Among them is the introduction of what are called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. So countries promise a certain level of emissions reductions every year. And this is voluntary. The There's no mechanism to enforce this, but it's the best we have, right? This is an agreement. It involves a lot of compromise. But this does mean that countries, set their own goals, and there's no mechanism to ensure that they do this. No sanctions or any sort of hard enforcement like that. And as we saw, most countries are not following through even on these commitments. So, continuing with this pessimistic outlook before we get into hopefully some hope towards the end of this talk, what are some of the barriers to achieving this transformation that we need? Right. So I called this the energy transition. We could also think of this as fossil fuel phase out. Right. So the most crucial thing we have to do is get rid of fossil fuels. So oil, gas, coal. This has to be the top priority. But there are lots of barriers to achieving this transition away from fossil fuels into renewable energy or a lower energy-intensive economy. So just a few of these. Well, right now, fossil fuels are still dominant. We've had some increase in the uptake of renewable energy, but fossil fuels still make up about 84% of our primary energy use. We also have the problem of energy poverty, right? So while we're trying to decarbonize and move away from highly resource-intensive economies, we still have millions of people living in poverty. And to achieve many of our other development goals, so other sustainable development goals, for example, we will need to increase energy use for the poorest people. The challenge is how to do this in a fair and just way. So how can we achieve a just transition, transitioning away from fossil fuels without hurting the most vulnerable people? Also related to this issue of a just transition is jobs. So in the United States, for example, millions, hundreds of thousands of people are employed in oil, gas, and coal sector, right? How can we transition away from fossil fuels, from coal production, for example, without hurting these working class people? These are a few of the challenges that we face. Another challenge, ironically, has to do with the way we talk about these goals. You've probably heard of net zero goals, net zero ambitions by 2050, for example. So there's an international goal to achieve net zero carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Many governments have national goals. The UK, for example, is very ambitious in its net zero goals. And most countries have some version of this. So this is a good thing, right? It's good that politicians are talking about achieving net zero by 2050. But it's the net part of this that we have to be very careful about, because this hides a lot of very technical stuff that has very important impacts on climate policy. So if you see here, for example, on the bottom left, the details of this chart don't matter particularly right now, but this is a carbon reduction pathway, a net zero pathway from the International Energy Agency. And there are dozens of others like this that lay out in very specific detail what kind of technology we need, what types of policies we need to get to net zero. One problem is that this often relies on technologies that don't exist yet or are not scaled up enough to actually be put into use. One example is BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Now, this isn't especially new. Actually, BECCS has been a key part of most of our climate models since the early 2000s, but it actually hasn't been proven and put into use at scale. So what BECCS is, it basically has to do with producing some sort of agricultural product that can be turned into a fuel source, say some kind of pellets, burned for fuel production, and then the emissions are directly captured by some carbon capture technology and basically stored underground. Right, so this sounds good. This is a sort of circular economy where we're growing our fuel, capturing the emissions, and preventing it from entering the atmosphere. But there are many problems with this. We can go into more detail in the discussion. But for one, this relies on massive land use, right? We don't have a lot of land here in Europe, so this is most likely going to happen, if it happens, in poor countries in the global south, right? So this is a scenario where companies are buying up huge areas of land, harming biodiversity, and using this to store carbon. These net zero scenarios also rely on several other technologies like solar geoengineering, direct air capture, which may become necessary for us and likely will, but don't exist yet in the form or the scale that they would need to. So what does this mean? This basically means that politicians can promise to achieve net zero by 2050 without doing anything right now. Right? This could mean that, well, we don't have to change anything now in terms of fossil fuel production, but in 2049, we need this magic technology that doesn't exist yet. And these politicians won't be in office then. Most people will have forgotten about them, but they can still make very ambitious goals without actually taking action. Now, another example, again, we can go into more detail in the discussion. Another example of something that's not really working in current climate governance is carbon offsets, right? Basically, what this means is a country or a company, instead of actually reducing their own emissions, they can buy a credit for these emissions to be reduced somewhere else. Say by planting a forest somewhere or a renewable energy project. But most of the time, what they're actually doing is, well, at least in principle, preventing forests from being cut down, right? So, for example, a carbon credit project can look at a big area of forest and make an argument that if we don't do something, there's a high chance that this forest will be cut down. It's quite an easy case to make, but hard to prove that this actually would happen. And then this can be used for a carbon credit. There's nothing stopping a timber company from then simply going to another part of the forest and cutting that down. That's called leakage. There's also no risk that the forest doesn't burn down or get some sort of beetle infection, right? So these are not very secure forms of environmental protection. This brings us again to this issue of climate justice, right? So another point that came up in these first series of questions. The question was, okay, is everyone equally responsible? Are we all equally accountable for action on environmental destruction and the climate crisis? And I argued that no, we're not. The main reason for that is that the poorest countries have contributed the least to climate change, right? So the countries who are the most directly affected right now by climate change, think of poor islands, small island states, or the poorest, most vulnerable countries, are the most vulnerable to droughts, climate conflicts, and so on, but have contributed the least to climate change. And this leads to some very, interesting dynamics in fossil fuel politics. So here we have two examples of two countries in the global south, both dealing with oil extraction, but with very different outcomes. So here on the left, we have the East African crude oil pipeline. This is in Uganda. Uganda discovered oil under some lakes several years ago, and this was very exciting for the country because this is a poor country with the potential to become an oil exporter, right? This is big for the country if the profits from that oil extraction can stay in the country, which is not guaranteed, especially because the largest investor, the largest backer of the pipeline project is Total Energy, a French company. So there was a lot of debate within the country if this is a good thing or a bad thing to discover oil. A lot of environmental protesters were fighting back. Many others were pushing for the oil production to take place. with the hope that this would lift them out of poverty and create new jobs. But it was actually Europe that stepped in. The European Union actually stepped in, passed a resolution to stop Total Energy, a French company, from carrying out this project. Now, if we're simply looking at the problem of climate change, fossil fuel phase out, looking at it from this black and white perspective, the fact that we do truly need to phase out fossil fuel production, it's a very clear moral issue that we shouldn't extract more oil anywhere. But why can't Uganda extract oil, a very poor country, when so many other countries became wealthy through the same types of activities? This is the question that was asked. And why is it that the European Union can stop this, right? So there's a lot of debate over the question of who has the right to extract oil, and it's not an easy question. Currently, the pipeline has continued, even though there's major pushback still from environmental activists. On the other hand, we have Yasuni National Park in Ecuador. This is a section of the Amazon in Ecuador, and there's oil. So the Ecuadorian economy relies heavily on this oil. But just this year, a binding referendum was passed to stop the extraction of oil. This was a huge victory for Ecuador, for environmental activists, but for the people in the local community who relied on those jobs, this was a very terrifying prospect that they would lose their economic security, right? So these questions of climate justice, a just transition, are very tricky. This comes up as well in the Paris Agreement, right? I'm looking at the time. We can get into more detail about this in the discussion, but this is something to look for in later this month at the next Conference of the Parties. These are the yearly negotiations of the Paris Agreement over this very contentious issue of what's called the Loss and Damage Fund. Right. So the question is, do rich countries have a responsibility to finance countries for historical loss and damage, economic, environmental, social damage from the climate change impacts caused by these rich countries? And this actually passed last year. This fund is going to exist, but in what form is a big question. And a year later, we still haven't answered that. I think I have about a minute. So I'll try to summarize what I really want to talk about, hopefully in the discussion I've left to the end. So we're really at a crossroads here. I've given a pretty, I think, pessimistic view of the scenario in terms of climate and environmental governance. And what I think the problem is, as I said in the beginning, we're lacking imagination about how to get out of this. We're stuck in a paradigm based on the current social economic system. And the way I would describe the paradigm that we're in now is green growth, right? So most of the solutions that we have to combat climate change all take place within market dynamics, right? Getting the prices right. So for example, implementing carbon taxes or removing fossil fuel subsidies. These are all very important things to do, but I would argue that they're not enough. Green growth also involves things like investment for research and development for new technologies. Technology is absolutely important, but if we look at the timescale we're on, it's not enough, and it's not happening fast enough. Now, to get some debate going in the second half, I'd like to quickly propose an alternative to green growth, which is the degrowth paradigm. Jason Hickel, anthropologist, has defined degrowth as a planned reduction of energy and resource throughput designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. It's important to clarify that degrowth is not about reducing GDP, but rather about reducing throughput, so our energy use, resource use. The idea here is that it's not possible to separate or decouple growth, economic growth, from carbon emissions, right? We need something different. We need to consciously scale down activities that are harmful, fossil fuel production, private jets, advertising, and so on, and scale up the things that are necessary for a just transition. So that means renewable energy, but it also means a less resource-intensive economy. That might mean a shorter working week. So that might mean more support, a stronger social safety net. This is a very complicated debate that we can get into more, but this is what I propose as an alternative. So to wrap up, what I think we need is a paradigm shift, right? We need to somehow look beyond the limits of the current economic system and political system and do so in a way, in a time scale that is historically unprecedented. So my best answer, which we can talk about more in the second half, is that we need a very powerful social movement. None of this is going to happen without a transnational social movement to pressure the political system, the economic system, to change beyond the paradigm that we have currently. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes. Good evening. My name is Marc Davidson, a philosopher at Radboud University. And as a philosopher, I have the easy situation that I don't have to offer solutions, but only questions. Nevertheless, I'll do my best. And we will certainly have something to discuss about, because I will, I'm afraid, talk about or propose carbon taxes, etc. All right, but I will mainly focus on in my point of view, the largest barrier to this problem of why are we not capable of having international climate policy, the climate policy that we need, that has been explained in the previous talk. So the biggest problem, and the term has already been mentioned, collective action problem, the biggest cause of the situation where we are in is that climate change is the biggest collective action problem that we have. What is a collective action problem? That's a situation in which we individually try to reap the benefits of our activities and try to shift the costs of those activities to others around us. We are all, well, we are altruistic to a certain extent and we care about other people. But at a core, we have this huge tendency to reap the benefits ourselves and try to shift the cost. But the problem with that approach is that it leads to a situation that is not in our own, to our own benefit, but instead it's detrimental to all. Collectively, we arrive in a situation in which we're much worse off than if we would have coordinated our acts. And this is an insight that is very old, and nowadays it's already taught at high school. Almost everyone is familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, which is a collective action problem, where due to the prisoners trying to improve their own situation, they end up in a situation that is worse than if they had coordinated. And it's also very well known from the environmental sciences in, I think, one of the most cited publications in all of environmental science by Gerard Harden, The Tragedy of the Commons, in which he makes a comparison between environmental problems and herdsmen on a pasture that is open for everyone. So what happens on this pasture? These herdsmen each individually try to improve the situation, take a decision. Shall I increase my stock, the amount of animals, and the costs in less grass are shifted to others. But what is the end result? Too much cattle, a loss of all grass, cattle dies, and perhaps the farmers as well. So that's the tragedy of the commons. But this whole idea of collective action problems, that we have to coordinate and solve this issue of shifting the costs to other people that has already a long pedigree, and for centuries we already discovered solutions, so to say. And in in political philosophy, it's already an old idea, very old publication, centuries ago, by Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, in which he said to solve these coordination problems, to solve the issue that we steal and murder each other and that we have a functioning society, is what we need is a sword from above that coordinates to make sure that everyone follows some certain rules. And in the words of Garrett Hardin, of course, who lived much later, what we need is mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. The tragedy of the commons can only be solved by mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. So we have to decide together on rules, but we also need coercion that we don't have free riders, that all people adhere to the rules. And that is depicted in the picture you see is the front of the book by Thomas Hobbes. So you see this sword, but the sword is used by the Leviathan. But if you look closely, you see that this Leviathan is made up of society itself, of people. And the same we need also in a democratic society. Together we have to make up these rules. And sometimes people think, well, why do we need this sharp sword? We're all rational people, behaving well. Most people are not that bad. De meeste mensen deugen. So why do we need this mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon? Well, then I often give this example. Imagine, take the example of Social Security. Almost everyone cares about Social Security and agrees with the fact that we all contribute to a system where the government gives money to people who are unemployed. I think there is overall support in society for that system. Well, imagine that tomorrow the government would say, come on, you're all grown-ups. Why do we have to force you? You are all in favor of the system. So what we do is we change the system. Everyone who wants money simply asks. It's up to yourself. It's your responsibility to ask what you need. We will not check because you're a good person. And they will send out these blue envelopes with only a recommendation for the amount of money that you can give. But of course, it's up to you as a rational person to send it in. Why do they have to force you? Well, how many of you think that that system would really work? In a short time, that system would collapse. First, there would be some free riders that immediately take advantage of the system. And a few days later, the vast majority of society thinks, I don't want to be taken advantage of by these free riders. So the system collapses. So everyone understands that to have Social Security, you need a sword from above, which the government has. And the same holds for environmental problems. Because, well, a similar graph has already been shown in the previous presentation, that what happens without this coercion, when you still have this collective action problem, then you get the tragedy of the commons. So here you see the same graph as before, previous lecture. You can see what is necessary, what has to be done to reach the Paris target. But no scientist was amazed, no political scientist, no philosopher, no psychologist, no economist was amazed that the target will not be reached because each country is allowed, as it was said, voluntarily to make a bid how much they will do. Indeed, that was the price for having a global agreement in the first place. It was hailed as a great achievement that finally the whole world agreed upon a global target, but the price of that unanimity was that each country voluntarily could tell what they were willing to do. And even if they do what they promise, and if you add up all these promises, by far it's not sufficient to reach the target. But that is what all scientists, academics would have expected, because there is no coercion. So in my mind, what we need is a global coercive mechanism. Economists would recommend 2 ways. We need to attach a price tag to carbon emissions to reduce emissions. So there are 2 options. Either directly tax carbon emissions globally, or it sounds like a different system, but basically it works the same, to have tradable emission permits. That means that if you want to emit, you have to show that you have a permit that you're allowed to emit. In both cases, carbon emissions get a price. These tradable emission rights, they can be auctioned by governments or the United Nations. At any rate, these carbon emissions will get a price. But what explains the difficulty of these negotiations? Why are we not able to achieve an agreement after decades? The first climate summit was 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was established. So we're already discussing 30 years. We still not really have a good agreement. But what explains that it's so difficult? I can talk about emissions in tons, but that won't tell so much, so I'll explain it in money terms. So we know that to reach this target, to keep the temperature increase below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we are not allowed to emit more than 40 billion ton of carbon in 2030. We also know that a reasonable price tag to emissions is in the order of 50 to 100 euro per ton. If you multiply the two, you get a staggering amount of 2,000 to 4,000 billion euro a year. That is the money on the table during the climate negotiations. So you have to imagine all countries sitting around the table, and on this table is 2,000 to 4,000 billion euro to be distributed each year. Then you can imagine that these negotiations, if they would be really willing to address this distributional issue, are so mind-boggling difficult, because the stakes are immense. This is the amount of money involved. So, decades ago, we had another environmental problem, namely the ozone layer depletion. That time, it was solved by mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. But why were these negotiations not too difficult? Because that problem could be solved much easier. There was a technological fix. So the amount of money on the table was a fraction of what is involved in the case of climate change. And that is what makes climate change so immensely problematic. We are not yet willing to address this immense distributional issue. And the problem is, if everyone would agree on the right approach, of course, tomorrow you would have agreement. But the problem is that countries disagree on what a fair distribution is of this amount. So, according to some, especially the developing countries, what is a fair approach is, and which also sounds to me as a moral philosopher the most reasonable, is that the more you have emitted in the past, the less right you have to emit in the future because you already used your share. And the wealthier that you are, the less you are entitled to emit in the future because you have stronger shoulders to carry the burden. So these two principles, the more you emitted in the past and the wealthier you are, the less the share of this pile of money you get. And these moral principles were also established during this first climate meeting in 1992 in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Well, what would that mean in practice? To make it more concrete, if you apply this, that would mean for the Netherlands that every year we have to pay 5 to 10 billion euro to developing countries to buy, let's say, emission rights, because we cannot reduce our emissions overnight. So we have to buy, to a certain extent, some space from countries who use less. And to pay for, we have to spend 5 to 10 billion a year. But opposing this moral view is another view which other people do consider a moral view as well. And that is simply that the more you emitted in the past, the more you are entitled to continue to emit. So you have to imagine there is a huge pie, and this pie is shrinking, and the people who ate the most in the past say, well, it's all right that the pie is shrinking, but we are entitled to the same share as we did in the past. So if everyone on this globe has to reduce emissions with the same percentage, so the United States, 10% less emissions than Bangladesh as well. That would mean no financial transfers between countries. This might sound strange, but this is the position taken by many industrialized countries, unwilling to make these huge financial transfers to developing countries. So some countries explicitly state that they take this position, but other countries, well, they don't dare to. But I think if you would ask society, few people are willing really to pay these large transfers to other countries. We already see in the European Union how difficult it is to justify transfers between countries. So that's the biggest hurdle, according to me, to the international solution. So, I also would like to offer you some hope how to solve this. But the problem is we consider ourselves Homo sapiens, very clever species. Perhaps we can do some things, but we are not as clever as we really think. We are rather short-sighted. We have difficulty really to imagine what will happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And we really have to do that in the case of climate change. Our cooperative skills are not that great as we think. We have less solidarity than we might hope. So how does cooperation come about? Well, in history, that generally has been due to external forces, war or catastrophes. So why do we have the European Union? Well, never to have the situation again that we had during the Second World War. So that's the big problem, how to unite the whole world. Well, one solution would be an alien invasion. So Mars attack, hopefully then we can really achieve global coordination. Or the other solution, which is more likely, is that climate change becomes so bad that we really don't see any other solution anymore. I told you the pile of money that's on the table in the climate negotiations. We already, also in Europe, we already saw some severe climate damage, as in this picture is from Germany a few years ago. But still, this damage is negligible in comparison to the money at stake. So this is not bad enough yet, unfortunately. So my only hope is that climate change will become worse, that it gives an incentive for the world really to come together, but not that bad that it's really terrible and too late. But at the moment, climate change is not bad enough to make us make this international effort, because we're simply too short-sighted and too self-centered as a species. Thank you for your attention.
We haven't solved the climate crisis yet, and we have 45 minutes to do so. So let's see how much we can achieve in that time. First of all, I saw a certain opposition between the two talks, and I think you already noted it. You think, despite the fact that you're not very hopeful, you do put some hope in taxes, climate taxes. You seem to be very skeptical. Can you react to this proposal? Why are you skeptical, and why don't you see that as a part of the solution?
Sure. Well, I do see these measures as necessary. I see them as very necessary first steps, but not enough. We're so far behind that actually achieving some of these would be a huge achievement. So I agree that if we could come to some sort of international agreement on a carbon price or a carbon tax, this would be a really crucial step. Same with fossil fuel subsidies. This also has to do with carbon prices. So fossil fuel subsidies, it seems quite obvious that we shouldn't be giving tax breaks or subsidies to fossil fuel companies. The economic argument behind that is that it distorts prices. So if we would achieve this, increasing the carbon price through taxes, something like this, what we would get to is sort of back to a baseline of free market principles. So right now we have a sort of unfair, not quite free market, because we're subsidizing fossil fuel companies, especially through tax breaks. So we would get to a more rational sort of base. But that still would leave fossil fuel companies in place, still operating, still with a massive advantage over renewables. So there needs to be some more fundamental policies that go beyond that, is what I would think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you react to that?
Well, I agree to a large extent. The carbon taxes will be, or tradable emission rights will be one solution. And I think it would set in motion many of the solutions you also propose. But on the other hand, I agree that what we need, because we have so little time, that sometimes I also doubt whether economic incentives are fast enough, and we don't simply need a Marshall Plan or war economy, so to say. Mm-hmm. So just as during the Second World War, to mention it again, countries, they didn't incentivize with economic measures that they want to restructure their economy. It was simply directed from above. So the government told these companies, you have to produce this. You simply shut down for the moment because we need this labor employment. Mm-hmm. So it has to be both, I think.
Yeah, and another issue that came up, and I think it was first proposed by you, Daniel, was that the little hope that you have, you put on social movements. Can you dwell on that a little bit more? Because it wasn't clear to me what you were referring to. What kind of social movements, and why would they be part of the solution, so to speak?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I think it's partly a justice issue, right? So we see already a lot of activism and pressure coming from the people who are already the most affected, indigenous communities and so on. So building on that momentum, I think, is a responsibility. But also, I don't really see an alternative to this, partly because, some of these collective action dynamics are part of this problem. One of my research interests is change and continuity, lack of change in political institutions. So why do organizations like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, who have exert a lot of control over the global economy, for the most part, why do they fail to change, right? Mm-hmm. And we need institutions to change at an unprecedented pace right now. So without external pressure, even though this is quite vague right now, this simply isn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. So I'm imagining something on the scale of, right now we see Extinction Rebellion and so on. That's good and that's necessary. But something that's transnational, global, and also in solidarity with these groups that I mentioned before. So fossil fuel workers, the labor movement, indigenous communities, people who will be the most directly affected. So something really on a massive scale. Mm-hmm. Whether that's going to happen, I have doubts, but that's the best hope, I think.
Yeah, but more or less against that, your model, the Hobbesian, the model of Thomas Hobbes, with the sword that comes from above, from the sovereign. There you don't have this movement from bottom up, as you are proposing, social movements, but actually a top-down movement. Erecting a global government, so to speak, that has the sword to maintain, let's say, climate laws. How do you think about this tension between the bottom up and the top down approach that you seem to have in mind a bit more?
Well, it's quite complicated. Well, I showed the picture on the top of the book by Thomas Hobbes. Well, Thomas Hobbes was absolutely not a Democrat.
No.
Because his idea was, once you have a Leviathan, no one should ever be allowed to question that person. But the graph shows that the Leviathan is made up of society. Yeah. And in a democracy, you can have a sword from above, but it only comes about in the democracy from bottom up, when people ask for it, when people protest, people vote. From a social movement that says we need. There was also a social movement for social security, but in the end, it has to be organized from above. Mm-hmm. So there's no conflict, I think, between the two. But the biggest problem with climate change is that there is a huge time delay between what we do and when it has effect. Yeah. So the climate change that we are experiencing now has nothing to do with any acts by you whatsoever, because that's our ancestors of 100, 200 years ago. And what we are doing now has an effect decades into the future. Yeah. So the problem is that the people that have to start the largest movement are people who are not yet born. And that's very difficult to have a social movement by people who are not around yet. Yeah. It's so complicated, this issue.
Yeah, but you're mentioning democracy. You're a political scientist. Isn't the problem democracy? Isn't the problem that we on the one hand we believe in democracy and believe that change has to come indeed from the electorate and from people voting and so on, from us. But on the other hand, we are indeed self-centered and short-sighted, and we don't want to change our life, and certainly we do not want degrowth, not personal degrowth at least. So aren't we nearing the boundaries? Also, we were talking about borders and boundaries and frontiers. Aren't we very close to approaching the frontiers of the democratic system as such?
I think so. I think there's a couple of aspects to that. So first of all, connecting to what Marc was saying, the farther we get along this trajectory, the worse the climate situation gets. The more likely it is, I think, that we actually take serious action. But that becomes dangerous because then we're not doing that in a planned way, right? We're taking emergency measures. You mentioned the war economy. We can also think of it as, crisis politics instead of normal politics. Normal politics are suspended in a real crisis. We saw that a little bit during the COVID pandemic. Normal norms about politics are suspended. That's the same in a war or a security crisis. We are in a crisis, but as you said, we don't feel that yet. So the longer we wait, the more likely it is that I think we have undemocratic solutions, authoritarian solutions. The second part is, about democracy. I would argue that we don't have economic democracy now. And that is, I think, one of the major problems. So decisions about how we use our resources, fossil fuels and so on, that's decided by these wealthy fossil fuel companies. You mentioned that most people wouldn't want degrowth. I think most people would want healthy societies, sustainable societies, but they have no control over resource use. They have no actual economic democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Could you follow up on that?
No, I fully agree.
That's a pity. Yeah, and I want to take the discussion one level up, and I'm afraid I'm a philosopher too. The level of collective. So what we're talking about is collective action and the difficulty of collective action. And the point you made is that in terms of crisis, collective action is probably only taken when the crisis gets bad enough, but not so bad that we can't solve it anymore. But we have seen in the past, there are examples of collective action where the outcome was something we're still proud of. The United Nations, for instance, as an organization. I know it's ineffective and you can say all kinds of things about it, but it's there and it has been a vehicle for peace and solidarity and that kind of stuff. So we as a species seem to be able, humankind seems to be able to achieve that kind of thing. Why isn't it possible? Because in this situation where we are facing a crisis, scientists, the figures you show that comes from science are clear enough. So why aren't we doing it now where we have done it in the past? It does seem the case that as a species we are able, but simply not now. Why not now? Both of you, maybe you first.
As I said, because we're quite short-sighted, indeed, we are very clever in responding to actual danger or solving things afterwards, like our Delta works in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
So indeed, we can do so. And also, you mentioned the Corona crisis. Indeed, then we had, in a short notice, we had the measures in place. We developed the necessary techniques. Mm-hmm. So we can do it. But climate change, even as bad as it already is, it's not yet a clear and present danger experienced by people. Mm-hmm. And you really need to have that attitude to have the real social change.
Would you agree on that?
I do. So I think a lot of it has to do with this on this level of behavior and collective action. I think we also have to look at the structural level too, at the economic level. There's a lot of money involved here, as you said, but also a lot of profit. So fossil fuels are very profitable for fossil fuel companies, and fossil fuel companies are very powerful within national governments in terms of lobbying and so on. Right, they're still able to secure subsidies in the form of tax breaks, even though this is very unpopular. That shows a lot of political power. At the global level too, fossil fuel companies in international law have the right to sue countries who threaten their profits. Mm-hmm. So these really the structural power of fossil fuel corporations in particular, this is something that I think has to be challenged in some way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how?
Well, this issue of crisis politics, I think, is important. So one possible solution, like I said, a powerful social movement. That's hard to imagine that we have so much power, that this movement has so much power that it can topple these vested interests. But if we can achieve this sort of paradigm shift, whether through advocacy and education and activism, or by waiting for it to get bad enough for the alien invasion, we are going to see. Well, it's more likely that we're going to see things happen that are unimaginable now. For example, fossil fuel companies have legal contracts extending decades into the future. They have a legal right to these profits, but that can't happen. They're afraid of what's called stranded assets. So they have all this infrastructure in place. They're going to lose billions of dollars or euros. It can't happen, but they have a legal right to. So to challenge actually these laws is going to take crisis politics in some form or another. Yeah.
And isn't... Yeah, you wanted to...
No, I completely agree. That's the point, is stranded assets. So it's not that the fossil fuel companies cannot change. I mean, they hire the cleverest people and they can develop the technology. It's that the value of their companies is in the oil that's still in the ground. So if they're not allowed to pump it up, the price of stocks go down. So it is as if Apple has made, which is the last iPhone, 14 now or something?
15.
Imagine they produced a billion iPhones 15 and they have it in store. But suddenly number 16 is developed, or they're not allowed to sell number 15. That's a disaster, not because they cannot develop something new. They have billions in assets there. And the problem is, it's not the assets of the fossil fuel companies, it's our assets. I remember one of the conversations with the pension fund, the big pension fund. Where is their money? Also in the fossil fuel companies. So if we say, simply take away these assets, take a ball pen, then your pension goes down. And suddenly people are less willing to make it difficult for the fossil fuel companies.
That's a good point,
Yeah. I was also wondering in this respect, in this connection, you brought up the notion of accountability. Isn't all of this indeed a problem of accountability, of holding who can we hold accountable for these problems? And we don't have mechanisms yet for that kind of thing. Isn't this all about accountability and responsibility, actually, really, at heart?
Yeah, I think it is. And, well, I had to skip over this slide, but I think we've actually seen some really interesting progress in terms of assigning accountability. I talked about this loss and damage fund in the Paris Agreement. It hasn't been a success, right? But the fact that it exists is a massive win especially for developing countries. So just briefly, this loss and damage fund is a climate finance instrument that would involve a transfer of funds from, well, the wealthiest countries to the poorest ones. That's typical in climate finance. But the difference here is that it assigns responsibility. The wealthiest countries, the countries of the global north, were very strongly opposed to this in the COP27 last year. They really fought against this because the wealthiest countries don't want to admit they have an historical responsibility. It's a slippery slope then, well, to this sort of, to admitting responsibility. But developing countries is called the Group of 77, won at the very last minute in basically forcing the wealthiest countries to admit they had responsibility. Nothing has happened with it yet, but this was still a victory.
And how do you see, as a philosopher and someone who's working on climate ethics, how do you see the problem of responsibility here, especially of collective responsibility? We're talking about the collective level here tonight. Can you dwell a little bit on that?
Yes, well, indeed, we have there's the difficult problem how to distribute for the future how much we may emit. That's rather complicated, and people really can have different views on that. But regarding the damage that is already occurring, that's much easier, because the polluter pays principle is a quite well-established moral principle also in law. And we more or less know who has filled the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. Not exactly, but we know how much Europe has done, how much Russia has done, how much United States has done. So there, it's not that difficult to make the calculation who should fill that fund. But indeed, all countries will be reluctant really to recognize responsibility.
I'm getting more and more pessimistic. I don't know about you, but...
No, the good thing, there's one good development, that in the past, or 30 years ago, you really had the industrialized countries in the developing countries. And the industrialized countries had all mechanisms, the World Bank, the IMF, to force developing countries to accept their terms in whatever negotiation. But now with China, China simply has become too powerful to follow. And all other countries are becoming more powerful as well. So that has completely changed the power dynamics.
But not for the better.
Yes, because that the wealthy countries were forced, as you explained, to accept a certain solution. Probably in the past there was no necessity to do so.
I would agree. So this is an open question. So we have the rise of emerging markets and developing countries are absolutely gaining power in global governance. So India, China, for example. Well, China, for example, has very high carbon emissions, but is challenging this sort of Western-led global governance regime. It's an open question whether that will be for the better or not. But this is sort of a third, well, if we think, well, we have crisis, social movement power, this might be a sort of third pathway, if not out of the crisis, at least towards, well, some alternative solution, is that we see different power constellations in the Paris Agreement or in global politics coming from developing countries.
So now we put our hopes on China?
Well, why not? During the Corona crisis, I had a PhD student from China, and he said, how are you going to solve this Corona crisis in this democratic system? It's almost impossible. So, and indeed, if you look at China, the speed with which they develop renewable energy, it's so much faster than in Europe.
Okay.
So it has downsides.
Okay. It's a thought, yeah.
Well, you cannot deny all the good things happening there as well.
Yeah, but I have this bias, and you probably have to cure me of that. Thinking that China is the solution to problems, I always thought China was part of the problem, but not the solution.
You can also say the West has had its chance for 2 centuries, and now we're in this situation.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, the term for this in international relations is South-South cooperation, right? So, in China, well, I'm not, not going to say that it's not seriously flawed in many ways, but is a leader in many respects in this sort of South-South cooperation. So countries cooperating together to challenge this the dominant global governance regime. So this group of 77, for example, it was 77 countries in the 60s or 70s. Now it's like 120 or something. Do have a lot of power within the United Nations system as a voting bloc. So it's not only China, but they often are sort of a leader in these negotiations.
Yeah, but there's a new sort of power emerging.
Exactly,
that's what you're...
So as I'm not claiming that this is going to be a solution, but this is sort of a wild card in a way, as an alternative pathway towards some different type of solution.